Welcome to lesson 4.6, grade 7s. This is the impact of contact. In this lesson, we are going to learn what was the impact of the fur trade on First Nations societies, economies, and sense of identity. So stick around and let's learn something. It is lesson 4.6. The question is, what was the impact of the fur trade on First Nations societies, their economies, and of course, can't forget, their sense of identity. This is all about the impact of contact. And as we go through this lesson, it's important to know that the fur trade that existed here in North America, this was a process that involved contact and, of course, economic development. We heard that in all of the previous lessons in this chapter. And that contact, we'll really investigate next year in grade 8 social studies, but that contact brings cultures together, both in a negative and a positive form. So we're going to take a look first at how the First Nations and the Europeans began to copy each other. Both groups borrowed ideas from each other. Both groups borrowed technology from each other. They were obviously trading, so they were seeing how different cultures interact and how different cultures have different ideas and how different cultures, of course, have different technologies. And this caused both the Europeans and the First Nations to adopt new ways of doing things. And this process evolved over time. But there were definitely some negative impacts that took place as well. As I mentioned earlier, contact is not always something that is positive. First of all, the Europeans made a lot of money from the trade. Now, that in of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but it came at a cost of the First Nations. The First Nations lost territory to the Europeans because of the fur trade, and this caused our First Nations to suffer over time. Their traditional ways of doing things changed. Their society as they knew it, and then as we have studied, eroded over time. They definitely lost their land, and there was a misunderstanding, whether it was cultural or language, there was a misunderstanding with these newcomers that were coming in. I've got a map here. These are the numbered treaties. We learn about the numbered treaties a little bit later on in our story of Canada, but these are agreements that First Nations made with the Canadian federal government. And we'll learn more about that later. And of course, you'll learn more about that in in grade 9 social studies. Their life changed. The First Nations' identity changed. Their way of life changed. They never worked the fur trade before because the fur trade didn't exist. It only existed when the Europeans came over. So their work, their idea of work and what they typically would do changed. So by being involved in the fur trade, they were trapping furs and they were hunting food for the newcomers that were now here. No longer were they doing this for their own individual nations. They were doing this for others now. They followed the fur trade because it was beneficial to them. So they left their traditional territories to follow this fur trade that was taking place. And this led to disputes with other First Nations because what was traditionally one First Nation territory was now being encroached by another First Nation, and obviously that's going to lead to some sort of dispute. They then also started relying heavily on European goods. So they started losing their traditional methods to get goods. What they used to use the buffalo for example, was now being replaced by European goods. And there was this trade that was taking place. The hunting of the buffalo also led to a decline in buffalo numbers. This picture here, this is of a group gathering buffalo bones. We learned in previous grades and we learned in previous lessons that First Nations used every single part of the buffalo. European mentality, though, didn't. They didn't use everything. They only wanted the best parts of the buffalo. And this caused the number of buffalo on the prairie to decline heavily. And of course, when there is some sort of contact that takes place, this was no different for the First Nations. They started losing their language because French and English were replacing all the various first languages, and those first languages began to decline. Another problem is the invisible enemy that becomes very visible over the course of time. That is disease. Disease by far was the greatest disaster to First Nations. Europeans brought these germs over. Everybody has germs, but the First Nations did not have immunity to these diseases. So we have influenza, measles, smallpox, whooping cough. None of this existed in North America until the arrival of the Europeans. So that is going to devastate the First Nation communities because there was no immunity to fight these off. And 60% of the First Nations population ended up dying to disease. That's hundreds of thousands of First Nations. Pretty sad. Another thing that was happening was how the trade was taking place and what was being traded. This portion of the lesson, we're going to take a look at Fort Woop and something called the whiskey trade. Fort Woop is just outside of Lethbridge, Alberta, and it was a place where trade was done for whiskey. And trading alcohol was not common until around the 1860s, when the American government down in the United States banned alcohol. So this forced many Americans up north into southern Alberta to trade for alcohol. This point in our story of Canada, there was no police out in the prairies at this point. It was kind of like a free-for-all, which led to a lot of violence. And in 1869, Fort Woop became the largest whiskey trading post. And there was about 40 posts all along the Old Man and Belly Rivers, but Fort Woop was definitely going to be the largest at the time. And this was a scary place to go and trade. This was a very intimidating place. And what they were trading, the alcohol that they were trading with the First Nations, was pure alcohol, which made many people very sick. So sick, in fact, that many ended up dying because of this whiskey and alcohol poisoning. Not only was that a reason why Fort Woop was intimidating, but it was also a very violent place. People were under the influence of alcohol. This led to a lot of arguments, a lot of fighting, and it was not a safe place for anybody to be. But there were also some positives that came out. So I mentioned earlier that French and English became the dominant language, and the positive result from that was the creation of Métis. Métis are dual heritage individuals. These are children of First Nation women and European fur traders. And today in Canada, the Métis have a very unique culture. We have their flag represented here. We learn more about the Métis in Chapter 8 in our story of Canada, but this is definitely a positive result of this cultural exchange that existed between the Europeans and the First Nations. All right, head over to your notebook and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.